Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. Well, it is the end of the year, so that means it's time for the annual guest list episode of the Virtual Memories Show. This is our 12th annual one. For the guest list every year, I ask that year's pod guests to tell us about the favorite book they read in the past year. Doesn't have to be something that was published that year, in this case 2024, but just something they read and loved. And I also ask them if they can tell me who, what book, or which author they're hoping to get to in the year to come. In this case, 2025. Now, Hanukkah starts on Christmas Day this year, and that's just a couple days away. So we're going to celebrate the whole gift-giving thing by giving ourselves the gift of books that brought us joy or changed our lives in some way. And I will share mine. It'll be an interesting selection. But to all you guys, I hope you read some good stuff over the past year, and I hope this episode helps you find some good books to read in the year to come. So 22 of our guests from 2024 responded to this year's invite. I do not give too much of an intro to the guests, so I hope you'll look up this episode on the webpage. It'll have the roster in our archives, and that's going to have at chimeraobscura.com/VM. You'll find a link to the guest list 2024. That's got links to just about all the books and authors mentioned this time around, as well as to each of our participants' episodes. And while you're there, you can also find links to all the past editions of the guest list. And like I say, I will give my stuff at the very end of this one. Don't hold it against me when I mention my goals for the next year, and then a year from now I don't hit any of them. That tends to happen. But anyway, let's get rolling. Sammy Harcum is up first. Sammy's graphic novel, The Blood of the Virgin, came out from Fantagraphics in 2023, but he was my first guest in 2024 when I was out in LA. So Sammy writes, while research is always the main drive toward what I should be reading and exploring, I've learned it's in the books I randomly pick up for pleasure that end up being much more useful and educational and inspiring for whatever it is I'm working on and trying to understand. So I always try to keep the reading scattered in tone, time period, approach, sensibility, region, etc. So his faves for 2024 are My Last Sigh by Luis Buñuel, the complete works of Jane Bowles, Independent People by Haldor Laxness, The Men's Club by Leonard Michaels, 100 Camels in the Courtyard by Paul Bowles, West with the Night by Beryl Markham, and Hate, the comic book numbers 1 through 30 by Peter Bagge. For 2025, he writes, that reading will hopefully focus on books already in the house piling up I've been meaning to get to for ages, but suddenly feels urgent. Reveille in Washington, Hamlet by Shakespeare, Judges of the Secret Court by Stockton, Frederick the Great by Mitford, The Obscene Bird of Night by Jose Donoso, various Western paperbacks, and a history of artists' biographies recommended by Dash Shaw. And I hope to read another of the Oxford History of America volumes, as those are always great, he writes. And regardless, I'm sure I will dip in with the regulars I read multiple books of every year: Charles Willeford, Jack Vance, Charles Portis, and Jonathan Ames. Up next is artist and writer Dmitry Samarov, whose new book is Making Pictures is How I Talk to the World. My best of 2024 was Life, a User's Manual by George Perec, he writes. This felt like a book that had been waiting for me all my life. Nominally a novel, this unclassifiable piece of writing takes place within one Paris apartment building during one moment, just prior to the death of one of the main characters, but also spans centuries and concerns itself with painting, what one leaves behind after they're gone, and the best way to spend one's time while still topside. It employs all sorts of creative constraints and plays many games, but never comes off as precious or obtuse as postmodern fiction so often does. It's a book I think I'll return to more than once. It's on the bookshelf next to William Gaddis's J.R., one of the few that escaped the major cull of my library that happened this year, Dmitry writes. And then he writes, Project 2025, which I should have named the section where I ask everybody what they're going to read next year. Anyway, his Project 2025, he writes, a couple of weeks ago, I read an article about hucksters making money publishing shitty versions of public domain books. This led me to wandering about Project Gutenberg's ebook list, near the top of which sits Moby Dick. I first read Melville's Ode to Hubris and Failure while going through a divorce 20 years ago. It resonated then in ways I couldn't have imagined at any earlier part of my life. I've decided to chase the whitest of white whales once more as an all-encompassing project and to see if I can beat some of the hacks at their own game. I'm going to attempt my own illustrated version. I'm currently 9 illustrations in to what will likely be at least 100. I have audio, PDF, and paperback versions of the novel within easy reach, and so far, I'm having a whale of a time. Sorry. If nothing else, this thing got me through the end of a marriage. Why not the end of a country? So our next guest is Laura Beers, who was on this year to talk about Orwell's Ghosts. She writes, "This is a difficult question. I ripped through The Ministry of Time by Kaliane Bradley after picking it up in an airport, largely inspired by the Orwellian-sounding title. Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead was a slower and more difficult, but rich and rewarding read, which made me want to go back and tackle David Copperfield. I enjoyed James by Percival Everett, but wasn't as crazy about it as others seem to have been. And for an older title, I'm currently finishing Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which is wild and mad and thought-provoking and just great. After Rushdie, I don't have anything definitely in the queue for New Year's, but I'm hoping to get a few good reads for Christmas or to pick up some suggestions from your site." Now, here is our first audio submission from Robert Pranzatelli, who is the author of Pilobolus, a history of that art dance troupe. That was a really fun book.
Hi, Gail. It's Robert Pranzatelli calling for your year-end favorite books podcast. I thought I would leave you a message to tell you, actually, I couldn't narrow it down to one, of course. There are 3. So I read La Danseuse, which is the latest Patrick Modiano novel. I read it in French. It's being published in English next month, January, as Ballerina. And that was a fantastic, subtle, beautiful, sublime reading experience. So I recommend that. And I'm also reading this pretty wonderful book by someone named Numa Sadoul, Sadoul, and the book is Dr. Mobius and Mr. Gir. It's a collection of interviews with Jean Mobius Giraud. As you know, he's one of my favorite artists and one of my inspirations. And these interviews were conducted over a period of 40 years, and so it's quite a treasure trove, beautifully illustrated. You get the story of Mobius in his own words. That's pretty great. And then finally, I also recently reread on Thanksgiving night the story The Thanksgiving Visitor by Truman Capote, which is a favorite. And I just can't get over how across my entire lifetime I can keep going back to Capote and rereading things that I would have thought that it would have been exhausted by now, that I wouldn't be able to continue to enjoy rereading these things again and again and again. But I do. And The Thanksgiving Visitor was originally published as a separate little book, but it's a story and it's included in Capote's complete stories. So that's the volume where people can find it. As you know, this was the Capote Centennial, and it was celebrated by Library of America by posting an essay about Capote by me, which was posted online on the Library of America website, and it's still there for people who might go looking for it. So I'm always recommending Mobius and Capote and Modiano over and over and over again, and this just proves I still am. Thanks, Gil. Bye.
And I'll put a link to Robert's Truman Capote essay in the show notes for this one. Dash Shaw, the artist whose latest graphic novel, Blurry, is just amazing, sent in the following. My favorite book I read in 2024 was Fernando Pessoa's Book of Disquiet. I read the Penguin Classics edition translated by Richard Zenith. It's all written in 1 or 2 page fragments. I could read one page and think about it for a while. Some segments I'd read multiple times. It's totally beautiful and on the side of the dreamers of the world. It's a real emo boy book. What I'm looking forward to in 2025 is Yoshihiro Tsuge, the next Yoshihiro Tsuge book in Drawn and Quarterly's Tsuge series, titled He Rolled Me Up Like a Grilled Squid. You know it's going to be good with a title like that. This Tsuge Life reprint project, edited by Ryan Holmberg, has been growing on the bookshelf in my studio. Each one is a gift. This next one reaches him in the late 1970s, when he's around the age I am now, so I get to see what he was thinking about at my age. Roland Allen speaks up next.
Hi, Virtual Memories Show. This is Roland Allen. I spoke with Gil about my book, The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper, in the fall. Had a really fun conversation. In my own notebook, I keep a list of all the books I read each year for moments like this. And looking at it, I think the book that I think hit the hardest this year was definitely Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. It's his account of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 80s. I grew up during this period in London, very much aware that something was going on with Northern Ireland. But like most English people, didn't really have a clue what the reality was like on the ground. And his book is, for me, a really fascinating, revealing account of those times, very much from a Northern Irish point of view. Really recommend that. And I'm looking forward to reading next year. I've just received via eBay a second-hand copy of a very old book, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, which is a massive history of the Mediterranean by Fernand Braudel, published in France in 1946 for the first time, and I intend to read it in English. It's massive, a huge history of the Mediterranean, which is an area I love and find fascinating, and apparently a real classic of historical writing, so I'm looking forward to that. Happy holidays to all of you, and Happy New Year too.
Up now is David Small. His new graphic novel is The Werewolf at Dusk and Other Stories. The best book I read this year, and among the best I've ever read, was Annie Proulx's Close Range, Wyoming Stories. I'm not generally drawn to tales from the West, but it was Proulx's sad and beautiful Brokeback Mountain that brought me to this collection. These stories are raw, brutal, sometimes terrifying, often funny, and thoroughly enjoyable. I'm looking forward to being able to read again after a condition, vertigo and double vision, that suddenly assailed me this fall. It is, I'm told, due to age and overuse of the eyes. I'm adjusting. I'm drawing less, but continuing to draw when and for however long I can without strain. Reading extensively will have to wait a while, but because I can't imagine a life without books, I'm hoping it'll return soon. Now, Ken Crimstein called in a few times with recommendations. Ken's new graphic novel is Einstein in Kafka Land.
Hi, Gil. This is Ken Crimstein, and the year-end wrap-up of reading. Hard to bring it down to one book, especially when you've got those books with pictures in them called comics. But anyways, I'll give it a shot. I think The Seawolf by Jack London is probably the most amazing book that I read this year. I had seen the movie, of course, with Edward G. Robinson, and it blew me away. And then I thought, wow, I've read some of London's stories, but I wanted to see what was going on with Captain Wolf Larsen, and I just thought it was a tour de force. With Cormac McCarthy has enough problems right now, but I do think that Wolf Larsen is right up there with the Judge. Really an incredible tale. Let's see. I also really enjoyed a novella by James Hilton. Here I am going into the early 20th century, called The King of the Bats, which was quite extraordinary as well. Hilton of Lost Horizon and Mr. Chips fame. In terms of comics or graphics, the strangest book I read in the year was called Flicker. Theodore Roszak, the social philosopher, psychologist, anthropologist of the 60s, wrote this incredible, bizarre, Baroque, labyrinthine, Borges-esque meditation on cinema and heaven knows what else. Edgar Ulmer, I don't know. Fascinating. So, okay, that was more than one. In terms of comics, Evil Eyes C, by really, really good book by Ozga Samanci. Great storytelling, great drawing, very fun, beautiful. Werewolf at Dusk, a foray into horror comics, really, really kind of like that. David Small, and volumes 4 and 5 of the collected Blueberry by Mobius and Charlier. Just incredible stuff. Really kind of, better than Indiana Jones movies. For this year, 2025, looking forward to reading James, Percival Everett, Japanese Tales, which I've started reading, edited by Royal Tyler, edited and translated. Oh, hi, Gil. Ken Crimstein. Got cut off, not surprisingly, blathering on. But just to finish, so I was saying I've started reading Japanese Tales, edited and translated by Royal Tyler. And finally, I'm going to reread, heaven help me, but in a different translation, War and Peace. But I can't remember who the author of that one is. I understand it's quite a long book. In any case, I'm going to read it in that sort of modern translation by those two folks, as opposed to the other one. Have a wonderful year of reading, looking, drawing, talking, running, and let's keep it together. Thank you, Gil. Thanks. Hi, Gil. Ken Crimstein again, because I came upstairs and I saw another book that I loved this year, The Mysteries, Bill Watterson and John Cash. I thought it was extraordinary. Nice to see Watterson back, and I was very moved by it. I thought it was quite unique. That's it.
Nicholas Delbanco is up next. We talked this summer around his new memoir, or memoir, Still Life at 80. Nicholas writes, I think my favorite novel, or more precisely, my favorite read of the year, was something published a year before, The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. He do the police in different voices, as T.S. Eliot and earlier Charles Dickens wrote, multiple members of a family in their flagrant Irishry, and a slow-paced yet action-packed tale. Of the books that stare at me reproachfully from the shelf, Robert Musil's Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, The Man Without Qualities, ranks first. I mean to tackle it at some point next year. For the record, and this is Gil speaking now, I just started The Man Without Qualities. It's become my morning read. I do one chapter a day. So far, the chapters are only 2 or 3 pages. At some point, they're going to be like 10 to 15 pages, and that's going to kill me. But I'm going to try and pace myself like that. Anyway, our next guest is D.W. Young, director of the wonderful documentary Uncropped. And he writes, I don't like picking favorites or ranking things, but 2 books I read in 2024 that pair well together and continue to resonate are The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and Tours of the Black Clock. That's about as much Hitler as I can bear in one year. For 2025, I don't have anything specific on tap, just the usual stack of unread books that only grows higher. Now, Leila Corman is up next. I loved her graphic novel, Victory Parade. You should go check that out. She writes, for 2024, 1. Thurston Moore, Sonic Life. This is my favorite rock bio I've ever read. Much of it is a love letter to and granular taxonomy of the New York downtown avant-garde in the late 1970s and 80s, a time period I wish I'd been present for, most especially for the no-wave scene, Glenn Branca and the 1980s noise rock era. He writes with unjaded love and awe for the artists, musicians, and writers he champions, and makes you feel like you were right there at that Suicide gig at Max's Kansas City, or in the audience bathing in the sonic assault of Branca's guitar orchestra. This book made me feel alive and excited to be an artist in my own time and brought back the New York of my childhood so beautifully. 2. Marie-Hélène Berlino's Beautyland. This novel is astonishing. One of the best works of science fiction I've ever read. Or is it? Is the protagonist really an extraterrestrial in the body of a little girl growing up in Philly in the 1980s? Or is this a metaphor for neurodiversity? The writing is exquisite. Layers of granular detail and observation, character, and place. Later in the novel, the author nails the spirit and feeling of post-9/11 New York so precisely it gave me aches. But right from the beginning, this novel does that with every time and character it explores. What an extraordinary read. 3rd, she says, Emil Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Book 2. Come on, you know you either love it too or you need to read it. Ferris is a fucking genius. I never wanted this beautiful, sad book to end. The art is so great it makes my teeth hurt. Emil, how did you become such a cool monster? And will you teach me? Now for 2025, Leela writes, I plan to read a lot of James Baldwin this year. I'm currently in the middle of No Name in the Street. His work feels essential to the time we live in right now, and only good can come from filling our heads with his genius. I have multiple ever-growing stacks of books I have yet to read by my bed, in my studio, in my office, in my living room. This year, I plan to finish Chana Porter's The Thick and the Lean, both the Mark Masters and the Thurston Moore Byron Coley books about No Wave, and the new 33 1/3 book about Einstürzende Neubaden's first album, Collapse, as well as a whole lot of comics. There's a copy of the Kafka Diaries on my nightstand. It's really thick, and I'll probably just read it very slowly for the next few years. Even more slowly, I'm in a 2-person book club that's just me and my smartest friend, where we only read Isaac Bashevis Singer short stories. We read 1 to 3 a year and text each other about them. Leela's got a pretty awesome life, I think. Jess Rulifson is up next. We talked this summer about Invisible Wounds, her graphic collection of veterans' stories. She writes, 2024, The Corner That Held Them by Sylvia Townsend Warner. She's sort of criminally underrated. The book follows a Benedictine convent for a few centuries. Some of that time, the characters are preoccupied with a plague. The very first page is beyond excellent, and while the pace sometimes meanders, I found myself wrapped with fascination for the characters in the book. I have a soft spot for the nuns, though. Everyone behaves badly, /human, and yet no one seems completely unforgivable. In the end, I found myself rooting for each character at least once. Probably a tie with that book is Mitz, The Marmoset of Bloomsbury by Sigrid Nunez. I thought a tiny book about a monkey that lived with Virginia Woolf was going to be a simple thing to read, but it haunted my brain, in a good way, for a solid week after I read it. An absolutely sneaky book that was deeply satisfying for reasons I can't fully articulate. For 2025, Jess writes, I seem to always keep a small stack of library hostages and never crack open before returning them, weeks overdue. I've been reading hard science fiction this year for the first time ever, and have in mind to read some of the big hits of that genre, namely Dune by Frank Herbert and The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. I devised a goal of attempting to read all the books I own that I've never finished, but that list is long and random. I visited the library more this year, so that feels like a win. An exception I make for buying new books is if the author is a person I am fond of or might know from real life. Betsy Lerner, literary agent to Patti Smith, was an early champion of my work. She's released her debut novel, Shred Sisters, at 64 years young, to much buzz. I'd like to read it since her nonfiction, Advice on Writing and Publishing, is so incisive and delightful. Up next is Sven Berkertz, with whom I recorded the day after recording with Jess. As a matter of fact, I'm only running these in the order that people replied and sent them to me. That's the arbitrary sequence that this is all running in. Anyway, by coincidence, Sven, who I recorded with the day after Jess, for his new book of essays, The Miro Worm, he writes, I've had a visually compromised year. I moved from book to Kindle, where I liked Bartleby and Company by Enrique Villa-Matas, Lesser Ruins by Mark Haber, All Souls Day by Cees Nootboom, and Fever and Spear by Javier Marias. It's volume 1 of Your Face Tomorrow trilogy. Our next guest is Jim Mosk, who put out the amazing book Deaths of Artists, about a strange collection of artists' newspaper obituaries he found in his role as the archivist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a really neat book. Go check out our episode. You'll find out more about it. He writes, "My favorite read of 2024 was Lucy Ellmann's Ducks, Newburyport. I enjoyed long, immersive texts, stream-of-conscious narrative, and fine-tuned musical prose. Ellmann uses all these devices to present the unsettling story of a woman's daily struggles and small victories amidst the looming threats of Trump-era America. In 2025, I hope to read all the septology novels of Jan Fosse. Alongside those, and as background for my own next book project centered on Alaska, I'll read a lot of nonfiction, including John McPhee's Coming into the Country." Now, the thing I'll say, this is Gil speaking again, Ducks Newburyport is one of those all single sentence books, like 900 pages long. Fosse's Septology is also a single sentence book, even though there's clauses and dialogue, etc. in the middle of it all. But anyway, I guess that's a trend Jim is onto. Eric Drucker is up next. I really dug his new graphic novel, Naked City, and he took me on a really fun mini tour of the Lower East Side when we did our podcast. And that's one of those joys of doing this show, that I get to meet people whose stuff I dug for decades, who take me around the places that were meaningful to them sometimes. Anyway, Eric writes, "Of all the amazing books I've read this past year, the two that stand out the most are Monica, the graphic novel by Daniel Clowes. Though I've read and enjoyed all of Clowes' previous work, the artwork, storytelling, and dialogue in this book work together so hauntingly that as soon as I came to the end of the book, I immediately read it all over again. In my opinion, Monica is by far Clowes' greatest work. And after allowing it to sit on my reading list for over 30 years, he writes, I finally got around to reading The Power Broker by Robert Caro. This masterpiece of literary nonfiction filled in so many of the missing puzzle pieces for this native New Yorker. Robert Moses, the book's subject, was responsible for building huge chunks of the city's infrastructure, including Stuyvesant Town, where I grew up. The epic volume, all 1,200 pages of it, felt extremely close to home, literally. In 2025, he writes, I intend to read Orientalism by Edward Said. I'm hoping this book will put many recent cataclysmic events in the Middle East into proper context. Then, to bring things up to date, I'm looking forward to reading my buddy Joe Sacco's latest graphic novel, War on Gaza. Our next guest is Frances Jetter, who I recorded with right before Eric on the same day, and she was in the Upper West Side in the sort of apartment building I've never been to before this, so it was a really interesting juxtaposition to go from that down to the LES. Anyway, Frances's book is this wonderful graphic novel / memoir / history called Amalgam. It's an amazing book. It's from Fantagraphics. Go get it. She writes, the cartoons and comics of M.K. Brown's Stranger Than Life, 1970 to 2013, express life's many irritations so charmingly and has been a source of comfort in this year of unparalleled irritation. One of her cartoons shows a man saying to a chest of drawers, I'm not going to vote at all this year. And the chest of drawers responds, so what do I care? Who cares? Not me. M.K. Brown's humor is a thing of beauty, and so is her graceful, hilarious, and gorgeous drawing. After I've stopped laughing, I want to continue looking. Now, Benjamin Dreyer is up next. His Dreyer's English is indispensable, so go read that. 2024, he writes, I am, as I have always been, reading. I notably took particular comfort these last few months, just to look to an odd corner, in making my way through my hefty stack of old DC comic books from the early to mid-1960s, revisiting the adventures of, mostly, Superman and Superboy, Lois Lane, Lana Lang, and the Legion of Superheroes. Not only do they reconnect me with my early reading self, and I've read some of these issues so many times that I've virtually memorized them, but they're marvelously uncomplicated. You might even say simple-minded, with very basic ideas of good and evil, right and wrong. Life is complex and complicated enough these days. For 2025, he writes, I have a massive stack of things to be read and or reread, as I always do, including, as I literally look at the stack beside me, Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown, D.M. Thomas's The White Hotel, a bunch of Bruce Chatwin novels, a bunch of Agatha Christie novels, and well, there's a lot. Shalom Ostlander's Fe, a memoir, is something I'm going to talk about in the Gill's Faves of the Year because it was one of the books that helped me along in the strange transformation that I've undergone. Here's what Shalom has to say. I've read 2 books about gods this year. Not the bearded man in the sky who was so Middle Ages or Middle East, but the new gods, money and technology. Tech Agnostic, How Technology Became the World's Most Powerful Religion and Why It Desperately Needs a Reformation by Greg Epstein, and The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity by Eugene McCarraher. As with all religion, the real trouble is believers, and the faithful followers of money and tech are as zealous and dangerous as bearded man's. They will admit no failing, accept no restrictions, tolerate no questions. Dawkins and Harris can continue to worry about Yahweh, but I think it's time we take on Mammon and technology, who may seem different from bearded man, but who are dragging us toward the same abyss. And he writes, I don't usually like history books, but I very much enjoyed Fears of a Setting Sun, The Disillusionment of America's Founders by Dennis C. Rasmussen. It's about how by the time the Founding Fathers grew old and died, they were each of the opinion that America was pretty much fucked, the whole project a dismal failure. The only one who didn't die miserable was Madison, in large part because he never had particularly high hopes for the country to begin with. The lesson? Aim low. Good stuff. As for next year, he writes, to be honest, I'm past the age when I tackle books or authors. I read what interests me. If it does, it never feels like tackling, and if it feels like tackling, I just put it aside. Maybe that's just laziness, but I believe it's a laziness I've earned. He's right. I shouldn't have used the term tackle for this stuff anyway. Our next guest is Randy Fertel, whose Winging It, Improv's Power and Peril in the Age of Trump will probably be helpful in the next few years, if anything's going to be helpful. He writes, it's an odd coupling. I finally took on Brothers Karamazov, an utter delight. I was amazed that so much novel is packed into just a few days, and that Dostoevsky managed to make the climactic trial, which must go on for 100 pages, so compelling. And then I started hearing about All Fours by Miranda July, another delight, and one surprise after another. Next year, he writes, maybe it's time to take on The Idiot. Our next guest is Mirana Comstock, who says,
I'm going to go full-out Nepo baby on this. Last year I found the unpublished manuscript for the Algonquin Round Table, 25 Years with the Legends Who Lunch, by my late grandfather, author, journalist, and longtime Algonquinite Conrad Berkovisi, in a trunk full of inherited family papers. SUNY's Excelsior Press, which concentrates on New York history, published it in May, with me as editor and writing the foreword. As a screenwriter, poet, and songwriter, books are the only kind of writing I hadn't been involved with, so it was all quite new to me. I also found 2 other unpublished manuscripts in that trunk, and even if they weren't by my grandpa, they would have become fave reads. A novel, The China Closet, focuses on how artists and writers living in New York's Greenwich Village in the 1950s are affected by its gentrification. Having lived in the village myself for many years, I can tell you it is, unfortunately, still very much an issue today. People move in to be around the creative energy, rents go up, and creative people can no longer afford to live there. We are currently adapting it as a miniseries. The other fave read, also by my grandfather, and also, so far, unpublished, is Up Close and Personal, Journal of the Century, a collection of memoir stories about some of the many luminaries in the family circle, including Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Dreiser, Mahler, Chaplin, and Modigliani, whose sketch of Grandpa is at the Modern Museum. These are my fave reads of the year, and my grandfather, Conrad Berkovisi, is the author I hope to tackle and explore more in 2025. There are, after all, 40 published books and hundreds of short stories and articles by him for me to read and hopefully share with a new generation of readers. Looking forward.
Maurice Velikoop's graphic memoir, I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together, is one of my faves from this year. He writes, my favorite book of 2024 remains Followed by the Lark, a fictional biography of Henry David Thoreau by Helen Humphreys. Partly because I read it while on holiday in Massachusetts, home of Walden Pond, not realizing the connection. It's a small book filled with big ideas. I loved Humphreys' unusual take on 19th century queerness. I found it deeply moving. And speaking of Massachusetts, while in Boston on that same trip, I visited the Gardner Museum for the first time and was totally smitten. So I'm dying to get into the Isabella Stewart Gardner biography, Chasing Beauty, by Natalie Dykstra. Recently, I also had the pleasure of visiting I Tatti in Florence, the estate founded by Gardner's mentor, Bernard Berenson, now owned by Harvard University. Lots of history, art, books, and high-toned gossip to learn more about. Now, Benjamin Sweat, my last interview guest of 24, is next. He is also my last respondent. His book of essays, The Picture Not Taken, is fantastic. I talked about it last week. It's really something. Benjamin writes, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun might be my favorite book of the year, simply for the strength and individuality of the characters and the way they're involved in such big things. I picked up the book in the LA airport and basically couldn't put it down until I'd finished it a few days later. I remember Biafra from when I was a kid, but realized reading the book how little I had known or retained. Adichie brought me right into it, but through these amazing characters. Another book I read this year that I loved was Anil's Ghost by Michael Ondaatje. As I said in our podcast interview, Gil, it was the way the main character connected to the landscape of Sri Lanka that particularly moved me. In terms of next year, I am going to make another attempt to climb the Magic Mountain, he writes. Olga Tokarczuk's new novel, The Impusium, which is based on the Thomas Mann novel and which I enjoyed, made me want to try to make an ascent that I failed in my 20s. And that's all the 2024 respondents. Now it's on to what Gil liked this past year. You can tune out now. My stuff's going to be all over the goddamn place. First, I'm going to divide between podcast reading and extracurricular stuff. And most of my reading for the year was for the podcast, as you'll get. I also keep a list on my website, much like Roland Allen mentioned, keeping every book he's finished in his notebook. I've got all the books I finished, which is prose and poetry, not comics, up on my website. This is me deflecting because I now have to make actual decisions about books. But there was a bunch of podcast reading this year. I know I'm going to slight a bunch of guests by not mentioning them, so 2024 was a year of significant transformations for me, and I'm going to kind of talk about the ones that seem to feed into that because they were meaningful, which is what I go for at this point. I mean, everyone had really good books. That's why I sat down and recorded with them, but let's talk about the books that helped change me, okay? So the first one in that case is going to be Facing Down the Furies, Suicide, the Ancient Greeks, and Me by Edith Hall, a classic scholar in the UK. That book was incredible in itself. It talks about historical notions of suicide, like the pre-Christian ancient Greek conceptions of it, what it came to mean, as mortal sin becomes a thing, and then how she dealt with her own family history of it and her own suicidality during university times, and how her study of the Greek tragedies helped pull her out of it and give her a new framework for how to talk about suicide and what it is. So, in and of itself, really good book. The thing was, prepping for it, I discovered that multiple members of my family have had suicidality in recent years. I thought there was only one of them. It turns out more than one have. And that was a really big frame shift for me and changed my conception of what I knew about the closest people in my family. And I'm not particularly close to anyone because I'm a terrible person. And it also got me looking at myself and wondering whether I had these feelings and notions and what it meant when I really had to tell myself and tell myself the truth. I did not. I don't have suicidality as far as I know, and I wonder if that means I'm actually comfortable in the world in some way. And that may have been a trigger point. There are a lot of different things that have gone on in my life that have been an ongoing source of transformation, but this may have been one of those sort of key moments, I guess. So that book is particularly meaningful for me. Now, that sort of dovetailed with Shalom Auslander's memoir I mentioned a while back, Feh. That just knocked me out, that book, and its exploration of what it means to try to live without assuming that you're disgusting in the eyes of God. You know, like not in a how can I be better for God sort of way, but in a what the hell is wrong with this world where we assume that we're all shit. And you get that a little from Shalom's write-up, the way he's talking about tech and Memon. It's a hysterically funny book and also an immensely sad one, especially when he talks about his relationship with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Hoffman's death by overdose. This book also raises some heavy questions about what we need to live with some dignity and how we can disengage from all that instrumentality that's there to make us wretched. So I was joking earlier, or just being reflexively self-deprecating about what a terrible person I am. I'm not. This book has been part of that shifting and transforming for me, I guess. And that sort of fed into my experience just a few weeks later of reading A Doorway to Joe, this coffee table book about the artist Joe Coleman, and then meeting Joe and his wife Whitney for a podcast. And that book is amazing. Doorway to Joe is phenomenal. The art, photography, essays by different people about Joe's life and Joe's work. The reproduction of the art is mind-blowing. Didn't help prepare me for what it meant to see some of Joe's incredibly detailed art in person. That sort of blew my mind a few weeks later, but it all set the stage for having my mind blown, because once I was there, after reading this book and after sitting with Joe and after walking through his home and talking with him and Whitney, it all started to help me see that we can bring other worlds into this one. We don't have to live the way the day-to-day, again, that instrumentality I mentioned just now, the way that inflicts itself on us and the infrastructure it creates. We can live differently. We can make something different and better and bring that into the world and share it with others. I guess by force of will or force of art, I don't know. So that experience is definitely high on my list, A Doorway to Joe. Now, a few weeks after that, there was Simon Critchley's book, Mysticism, and that approaches this sort of from another direction, going into like medieval Christian mystics and what their experience was and what the transmission of tradition means. And I took a lot out of Simon's book, even through his contention that aesthetic experiences, especially music, whether it's, by yourself listening to an album or being at a show of somebody whose work you adore, okay, Nick Cave, how that's substituted for religion when it comes to like modern era transcendent experience. And in the book, he doesn't explore exactly whether that's good or bad, just presents it as sort of the reality of how we live. But we talked it through in our podcast, what it means that we, this is the mystic experience or the transcendence we have nowadays at best. But he goes into so much more throughout the book. It's really a fascinating work, and it's, again, sort of helped shape some of what I'm dealing with, or at least explore and explain what's going on in me. Now, there were a couple other books that maybe weren't personally transforming, but they were fantastic. So I'm going to give those pride of place here, too. The Work of Art, How Something Comes from Nothing by Adam Moss. That one, Adam interviews a bunch of creative people about a specific piece of art they made. Graphically, it's a gorgeous book, and the interviews go into like the process, what they did, how they did it, whether it's Tony Kushner writing Angels in America. Oh gosh, I'm blanking out her name. The woman who did the gigantic sugar sculptures in the old Domino Sugar Place in Brooklyn. There's a whole bunch of great conversations with people. And it's different than the old days when I used to read the Paris Review Writers at Work interviews with the idea, this is when I was in my 20s, that somehow there was going to be some key there that unlocked creativity that would have made me, quote unquote, a writer. That doesn't exist. But what the work of art does is show what the work is and what that process of trial and error is like, what artists have to stretch to do and why. It's a really fascinating book and gorgeous to look at. Now, Christopher Brown's A Natural History of Empty Lots is also beautiful. I will say it's nature writing, but he is not writing about, going off into the wild in seclusion, etc. He's looking at how the wild continues to spring up in urban environments, especially his home of East Austin, Texas. Now, I've adored Chris's writing for years. This book is an absolute treasure. It springs off of his weekly, semi-weekly now, Field Notes email newsletter, but really starts to get into what man's relationship to nature is and how nature is just waiting for the opportunity to come back on us. It's an amazing book, A Natural History of Empty Lots. Now, I also dug Roland Allen's book, The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. That one, on one side, it was just, in terms of helping me see not just how notebooks transformed art and commerce and may have created art in a different way because artists could now make drafts of things instead of having to commit to whatever the one thing is. They could sketch, But beyond that, he really gets into this sense in which journals and diaries and other uses of notebooks play a role in reshaping what human identity is. Like the creation of a private self comes out of this in certain ways. And it's amazing to read. And I really continue thinking about The Notebook and have I enjoyed reading the book in the moment, but it has stuck with me, and that's why it's on this list. And my last guest of the year, who I mentioned earlier, Benjamin Sweat, he wrote a wonderful series of essays about photography, art, life, loss, a really, really horrible loss, and family. It's called The Picture Not Taken. It's a subtle and graceful book, and I really hope it finds a deserving audience. And then, I forgot about the comics. Okay, so there's also some comics I read. They weren't on my list of books because that's prose books, but definitely Maurice Velacoup's graphic memoir, I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together. That one's got so much joy and pathos and transformation and celebration to it. It shows us Maurice's coming to terms with his sexuality, his family's response to that, his artistic ways of trying to sublimate it through art and then finding himself truly through the art, and so much more. It is a fantastic book. I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together by Maurice Velacoupe. Now, one of the strangest but most affecting graphic novels I read was Ain't It Fun by Aaron Lang. That's just an incredible book about the late Peter Lochner and the early punk scene in Cleveland in the 70s. Every page is a standalone graphic, like a designed poster of sorts, not panel-to-panel continuity like a comic that you're used to. And between the graphics and the integration of his text, he threads this book with musical themes and cultural history and a lot more. It's like this will sound weird. It's like a comic version of Grail Marcus's Lipstick Traces, which I mean in a really good way. It is a unique experience and one that has stuck with me since I read it early this year to record with Aaron. So Ain't It Fun? I also dug Leila Corman's graphic novel of World War II, European Jewish refugees, and ladies wrestling, Victory Parade. That is a beautiful book to look at, and the story is just devastating. But go check it out, Victory Parade, Leila Corman. Also had this really great and weird experience reading the collection of Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, which Fantagraphics put out this year. It's his weekly comic strip that started in the 70s in the Village Voice about real life in New York City and, environs. And I dug the comics and the writing, and it's something I used to read when I was a kid, but I didn't get it, because I was a 12-year-old kid reading the Village Voice. I was looking for the hot personal ads, for unspeakable reasons. But anyway, as an adult, reading Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies and really getting it this time, it hit me that what I do is follow Stan's footsteps. Like, it's a different mode. I make the podcast every week. He made this comic strip every week. He was getting paid to do it, but it really occurred to me that our projects were not that different, that I have a precursor. I have a number of precursors, but, he was one of the guys who sort of blazed a trail for what I do with the show. So getting to meet Stan was wonderful, but the experience of reading the book and coming to that realization over time was also very meaningful for me. And I guess going back to prose, speaking of like that 70s into 80s New York, I should cite Brad Gooch's biography of Keith Haring, Radiant. That, about an artist who compressed just an impossible amount of work and success into such a short span of time, basically like 10 years. That resonated with me beyond all the great details of 80s New York that Brad brings to it. So yeah, Radiant, Brad Gooch, biography of Keith Haring. Anyway, I loved all my podcast books, and this is one of those Sophie's Choice moments. So if I didn't mention yours here, that's on me, not you. Now, as far as my non-pod reading goes, 2023, the big extracurricular project was rereading all of Thomas Pynchon, except for Against the Day, which I had finished in 22. This year, the big extracurricular reading project that I kind of fell into was Karlova Knausgaard's My Struggle. 6 volumes, 3,600 pages. I enjoyed the living heck out of it. The first 2 of the 6 books were absolute page-turners, which I've gone on about in past episodes of the show. And I will admit, I started to slow down in books 3 through 5 when it was about more of his early years, when the books started to become conscious of themselves. So I'll put it that way. Or it felt like Knausgaard was becoming conscious of what he had done in books 1 and 2 and had to keep producing. I don't mean it in a hack way, but keep exploring in ways that maybe had some dead ends to them or just didn't work exactly. Then he hits book 6, which is 1,200 pages long with a 400-page essay about Hitler and why the book is called My Struggle. And that is just absolutely recaptures the momentum. The whole series becomes this absolute monument because of what he does with this final volume. It was an absolutely incredible experience, and one that I'm sticking with, which I'm sure I will dive back into in bits and pieces. Had a conversation with a past guest recently about Knausgaard's art criticism, which he contends is absolutely full of shit. I should avoid, some of the fine art things that Knausgaard writes about, but still, narratively, this is just an incredible, incredible book. So that was the big accomplishment for 24. The other big one was that I managed to finish reading the collected poems of Emily Dickinson, which I was doing 2 pages of every morning that I was at home, along with the previous day's 2 pages while I try and figure those out again. I got some great poems and great lines out of that, but it was all too much. It's not the way to read this thing, but it was still Gil doing his big dick manly thing of, I will finish this assignment, and I did. Let's see. In keeping with the Edith Hall thing, there were 2 books about suicide that I really dug this year. In Love, which was Amy Bloom's memoir about her husband's assisted suicide as a result of his early Alzheimer's diagnosis. And One Friday in April, about Donald Antrim's near suicide. He was walking on the roof of his building getting ready to jump, and that kind of leads to him getting institutionalized and through ECT coming out of it somewhat. But it really gets at what that despair was like and then what the ongoingness of it was. And there's this cameo by David Foster Wallace trying to help him get through this. The irony or horrible notion being that Wallace himself lost the fight and ended up killing himself. But anyway, those both sprang up in the wake of that Edith Hall Facing Down the Furies book and all the family stuff that arose as I prepped for that podcast. So no, you should not worry about me. That's what I was saying when I was talking about Edith's thing. I discovered that I'm not suicidal and that is somehow defining for me. Now, the straight-up novel I enjoyed the most, because we call my struggle autofiction, which isn't exactly a novel, but I have thoughts about that. Anyway, the novel I enjoyed the most was Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers. It is the novel that inspired the Tarkovsky movie Stalker, and it's just phenomenal. I'd never read the Strugatskys before this. Moldovan friend of mine kept telling me I need to. I have finally done that, Konstantin. I will read more of them in the year to come. It's got more of a plot and a sense of time, Roadside Picnic does, than Stalker. Part of that, I think, is because Stalker had this horrible production issue where like a year's worth of film got ruined and all this stuff. So maybe it's not the movie it was supposed to be for Tarkovsky, whatever. The novel goes into much more of the life outside the zone, where the aliens hit the Earth and then withdrew, and everybody is left to figure out what the hell just happened. So we see more of the effects on the populace and what it's like to build a life outside of the zone. And, you know, in some respects, it reminds me of how Tarkovsky adapted Solaris by Stanislaw Lem, where he has to jettison huge chunks of the book, largely because those parts of the book were sort of like the cetology chapters of Moby Dick. Like, you can't film these sort of, historic reports and scientific data about this strange planet that these people are on. Anyway, the lead character in Roadside Picnic has a much longer story arc than the lead in Stalker. There's a bigger world outside the zone. It's a haunting book. It complements the movie experience well, but even by itself, Roadside Picnic is haunting. You should go check that one out. It's some really good science fiction and good metaphor for what the Soviet Union was like, I guess, in that 60s and the 70s stretch. Anyway, there wasn't a lot of other new reading, to be honest. My struggle took up a chunk of it, and the podcast reading was really a lot this year, especially with all the other stuff I had going on. I did reread a couple things. Philip Roth's Everyman, which I used to revisit every year. Hadn't gone back to it since like 2017. This is the first time I read it since my leukemia diagnosis, and it is about an old Jew dying, and it struck me differently. There's one character who's a friend of the lead character who is dying of prostate cancer, and some of his interactions with our nameless narrator, our nameless everyman, resonated differently than they did in 2017. I'll put it that way. Along the same lines, I just finished The Moviegoer by Walker Percy. According to my list, I have not read that since 1992 or 3 when I was in college. I'm not sure what I made of the book back then. I had virtually no life experience, nothing to compare this to, no sense of what the aimlessness of Binks means or meant. Now, Percy's coming from a Christian perspective in a lot of ways, but I didn't understand. And now I've gone through middle age. I've looked at mortality in different ways. It was a more interesting experience this time to read The Moviegoer. I'll put it that way. Same thing. First time read, I had a weird experience with Knut Hamsun's Hunger, which Knausgaard inspired me to read. That's another aimless, semi-questing, curious thing, which I guess is the mode just now for me. I mean, I actually feel like I'm finding a direction or finding something inside me that needed finding, and that's helping me, or that I have to figure out how to help me kind of move toward the world. Maybe I'll talk about that next week. Maybe I'll do a year-end monologue about all this stuff, but this will be your prep for that. Not that anybody listens to this stuff in real time, especially right before Christmas. Anyway, this has been a tough year to focus. I'm just glad I did all the podcast reading and kept up for, this is episode 49, not including the 2 bonus episodes I did this year. So I think I'm keeping a pretty good pace. Now, as 2025 goes, I listed my 2024 goals last year. I did not hit a single one of those. That included The Snow Leopard by Peter Matheson, The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard, Secret Life of Emily Dickinson by Jerome Charon, A Loaded Gun, Emily Dickinson for the 21st Century by Jerome, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Didn't read a single one of those. I will, at a minimum, get to The Snow Leopard, because I'm going to be recording with Lance Richardson next fall for his biography of Matheson. I figure I want to get to Absolution, the fourth novel in Jeff Vandermeer's Area X Southern Reach books. Probably do Salman Rushdie's new memoir about his attempted murder, Knife. As I mentioned earlier, my morning reading is going to be a chapter a day of Musil's The Man Without Qualities. There are 123 chapters. There'll be some travel days, and I'm not going to take it with me on the road. If I keep up the daily thing, that'll take me into May, maybe early June. The other big thing on my shelf, and this is one of those Gil tackles big books because of the big dick fetish and all that stuff, I guess, but Uwe Johnson's Anniversaries. It's a slipcase 2-volume gigantor. I recently recorded with the book's translator, Damian Searles, and he made it sound awfully good, and so maybe I'll start that. Maybe I'll get it on the Kindle and read that in bed at night. I'll have to see. But anyway, that is some of what I want to get to in 2025, plus, of course, reading more Shakespeare, reading more poetry, blah, blah, blah. But really, I just want to keep up with the show, produce another 50 good episodes, and discover new stuff. And maybe if this year of transformation turns into a life of transformation, maybe I find some of those things that Bing Spalling wasn't able to find, I guess, in his great search. Anyway, that is it for the 2024 edition of the Virtual Memories Show guest list. Thanks for sticking around, and thanks for listening throughout the year. I'm just really happy to have had so many great books enter my life and to have so many creative people to talk to. I hope we'll get to meet up here next year for another round of the guest list. Maybe by then I will have finished and put out my own book of photography and prose called Guest Host. If so, maybe that will end up on somebody else's guest list as their favorite read of 2025. I will do my best. Thanks. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.